Hi guys! This book review is on The Lost 116 Pages by Don Bradley. Now, this book review has been a long time coming. I read this book over a month ago, and the reason it's taken me so long to do a book review is because I've just been thinking a lot about this book. There's a lot to discover about the Book of Mormon and what was in the Lost 116 pages that I just had to dissect it. It took me a long time because there was so much to dissect. And I wanted to make this book review really good because I think that this book is so important. So it did take me a long time, but here I am back on the book reviews. And I'll just try to share. There was so much in this book about what could have been in the Book of Mormon, and I'll try to share some of the really cool things that were probably in there. For headband time, my headband today is this plaid one, kind of retro schoolgirl. So, alright, well, I think it would be helpful to kind of just give you an idea of what you can find in this book, the contents, because I'm telling you, everybody needs to buy this book. So, there's what you can find in the book, and then I'll explain what I liked about the book a little later. So, the first part of the book is all about how the first half, or the quote unquote 116 pages of the Book of Mormon got lost, and kind of the backstory of Joseph Smith and Martin Harris and Martin Harris's wife. The popular notion is that Martin Harris's wife is the culprit, the one that lost them. That's the well-known account. But Don Bradley does a pretty good job giving some other suspects that it could have been, and kind of disproving the theory that it was Martin Harris's wife. If you grew up in the church, you know the backstory that when Joseph Smith and Martin Harris were translating the Book of Mormon, Martin Harris asked if he could take them to show to people because he was, wanting to prove that this was legit and wanting to please man. And so Joseph Smith said no the first two times, and then the third time he finally gave in to his friend Martin Harris and let him have these pages, and then Martin Harris ended up losing them. Okay, anyways, I'm on a tangent. But so the first part of the book is the Ark of the New Covenant, the sealed book, translating the Nephite record, the manuscript theft, the long blue lost manuscript. And then the second half of this book is all about what could have been in those pages. And as a English teacher, book nerd, I love taking apart books and what the themes and patterns are in them. And as an English teacher and a devoted disciple of the scriptures, or try to be, I love taking the Book of Mormon and doing this and literary analysis as you would as an English teacher. And so Don Bradley says there are a lot of things that could have been in the 116 pages, and he does a very convincing job using research and evidence to prove that these things were most likely in there. And if you don't believe it, read the book to be convinced, because I sure was. Starting off with Lehi's Exodus, he argues that there was a Passover setting for the Exodus when Lehi left Jerusalem with his family, his sons Nephi, Laman, and Lemuel, and all of them. He also makes a parallel with Nephi and when Nephi killed Laban and how that was very similar to David killing Goliath. And something you'll see in this book is Don Bradley makes so many parallels that we see with the Book of Mormon and the Old Testament. Goes on to the 116 pages probably gave a way more detailed account of Lehi's exodus and settlement, breaking everyone up into tribes, just like Jacob in the Old Testament broke his posterity into the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, Lehi broke them up into 7 tribes. Lehi's tabernacle in the wilderness. There's a lot of evidence that on their journey, just like the Israelites of old, Lehi had a tabernacle, and the Liahona was similar to the instruments of the Israelites, and Aaron having the staff and the manna that came to the Israelites. Okay, and then moving on to after Lehi's exodus and the settlement and breaking up into 7 tribes, then we have Nephi's kingship and conquest is what Don Bradley calls it. And he makes a parallel that Nephi is a lot like, there's so many similarities to Nephi and David in the Old Testament and Nephi and Joshua in the Old Testament. Oh, and going back to Lehi, Don Bradley says there's a lot of parallels with Lehi and Moses. Then Nephi's temple. Do you know that there was a city of Nephi and a temple? Well, he gives a lot of evidence. Because some people ask, well, why do Mormons have temples? Like, the Book of Mormon doesn't even talk about temples. Like, you're not following the Book of Mormon. Well, besides the lost pages, there are a lot of times that it says temple in the Book of Mormon. You just have to pay attention and underline how many times it says temple. But if we had the pages that were lost, it would have gone way more into detail of the Nephite first temple and the structure of temple worship that Joseph Smith had this knowledge of when he was translating this first part, and he took a lot of those things to help with the restoration. Then another contents is the lost middle period, which was this whole time between Lehi and King Benjamin, because the beginning of the Book of Mormon, our current day Book of Mormon, starts with Benjamin. But if we had these lost pages, it would have started with Lehi. Oh, I shouldn't say that. The Book of Mormon does start with Nephi, but it's the small pages that Joseph Smith had to use to replace Moroni's abridgment. He was commanded by the Lord, well, you lost these pages, so use Nephi's small pages. That God had a backup plan, let's just say. Okay, now, God and a Mennonite in the temple. I could talk a lot about that, which I will. The Mosaic Reform and the Book of Benjamin. Okay, and after finishing the book, I made these slides to help me see a review of everything I learned from this book, of what was in the last 116 pages, and I think it could help you too. So, like I said, it's more detailed account of Lehi's exodus. There's themes of exile, promised land, founding a new nation of Israel, and restoring what had been lost. Let's see if this works. Yeah, anyways, I really thought it was cool how Don Bradley was able to show that there was a strong Jewish evidence of a Jewish festival and the Passover probably going on. Lehi's conquest. While information about the early stages of Lehite settlement is scarce in the small plates, it was more abundant in the lost manuscript. The omitted narrative of settlement and conquest belongs to the Nephites' political history, a subject skimped on in the small plates but reported by Nephi to be detailed explicitly in the lost manuscript source, Nephi's large plates. So Lehi, as we've seen, blessed his children and grandchildren, dividing them into 7 tribes. 7 is a sacred Hebrew number, and warning of the perpetual conflict that could break out between the nation of Nephi, who was chosen to rule, and the descendants of Laman and Lemuel. And then Don Bradley pointed something out to me that really helped my understanding of the Lamanite curse that I think some people have a hard time with in the Book of Mormon. But if you think of this in Old Testament terms, the Lamanite curse was a lot like how the Israelites saw the Canaanites. And, if we believe that the Nephites were influenced by their Israelite heritage, they could have seen the Lamanites a very similar way to the Canaanites. That they had this curse, that they were slothful and lazy, and they were their enemy. I'm sure that the Lost Plates talked a lot more about finding the Jaredite society that was destroyed. And the Jaredite giants parallel a lot of the biblical giants. In Nephi's kingship, it would have given more detail about Nephi as a military and spiritual leader, because the small plates say that it's only focusing on the prophesying and doctrine and the prophecy spiritual part of the record. And the large plates were more about the political and military and historical part of the record. So we're missing this rich narrative about Nephi being this great leader like Joshua and King David in the Old Testament. And I like this. Nephi preserves his people's Israelite identity by establishing institutions like those he knew in the pre-exilic Israelite Commonwealth. Despite that Commonwealth's destruction, his people were not long bereft of sacred city, temple, relics embodying God's presence, instruments of revelation, and a divinely chosen king. With Lehi as their Moses, they found a new promised land. Under Nephi, they built a new Jerusalem, and in it a temple where they housed the memorials of their exodus. And those sacred relics were the Liahona, the brass plates, and the sword of Laban. So they probably housed those in the temple, just like the Israelites housed their sacred relics. Okay, the temple. Oh, well, this is talking a little bit more about the Nephite line of kings, because we know that the beginning of the Book of Mormon was more focused on kingship, and then they moved into the reign of the judges later on. That's where we get most of the Book of Mormon, is the reign of the judges that we have. But we would have had more about the Nephite line of the kings, with Nephi as king, Benjamin, Mosiah the one as king, and Zeniff and Noah. Oh, did you know that the Nephites' priesthood was based on the model of Melchizedek? Prior to the separation of temple and state under the reign of the judges, the symbols of regal power and the sacred implements of the high priest were one and the same, because the king and the high priest were one and the same. The model which the priests for the Nephite priesthood is thus very different from that of the Levitical priesthood, in which the priests comprised a distinct class and lineage. Lacking Levites, the Nephites had to appeal to a different precedent than Aaron to ground the authority of their high priest. The model they chose was the archetypal priest-king Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God. Rather than being a Levitical priesthood after the order of Aaron, Nephites' priesthood was modeled primarily on Israelite royal priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. So the original model for such rulers in Nephite society was Nephi himself, who was a prophet, a priest, and a king. I found that interesting. in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have these two priesthoods that young men get. They start off by getting the Aaronic priesthood, which is modeled after Aaron, and the Levitical priesthood, and then they move up to the Melchizedek priesthood when they're older. Okay, the lost pages would have given more about the city of Nephi and temple. The temple, so is there evidence that there was a temple? That this name, the Temple of Nephi, was used in the Lost Pages is evidenced by one of the earliest newspaper articles on the Book of Mormon and the emerging restoration. In the summer of 1829, Martin Harris visited newspaper printers in the Palmyra area to persuade them to print the Book of Mormon. Martin told them about the book's content and that its publication was to result in the establishment of a New Jerusalem. Soon thereafter, Jonathan A. Hadley published articles on the Book of Mormon in the Palmyra Freeman, reporting that he had learned from Martin. One article relayed that believers in the Book of Mormon intended to construct a New Jerusalem with a temple within it. Hadley thus provided the earliest glimpse of intentions to build a city of Zion and a temple, one referred to as the Temple of Nephi. Martin calling the anticipated New Jerusalem temple the Temple of Nephi has two vital implications. First, it intimates that the phrase Temple of Nephi was used in the Lost Pages as a name for the Nephites' first temple. Second, it indicates that the earliest believers in the Book of Mormon either used Nephi's New Jerusalem and temple as a model for the New Jerusalem and temple they intended to build. Nephi described the Temple of Nephi as like the Temple of Solomon. There would have been more about the structure of Nephite temple worship. Okay, something really cool in this book is it gives the history of the Sword of Laban and how there's so much evidence, and you might be mind blown at this, that the sword goes back to Joseph of Egypt. That it was carried down from Joseph of Egypt, who was a seer, just like Joseph Smith, but back then, who could see the future. He had a lot of visions of his posterity and the promises in the Old Testament. And he knew that part of his posterity would be the Nephites and Lamanites in the Americas, that they would come to this land. So awesome. This is so cool. The history of this sword is as follows. It was caused to be made by Joseph of old in Egypt by the direction of God, and was in the hand of Joshua when he led the house of Israel into the land of Canaan. And after him it came down in the lineage of Joseph to Laban. Then there's also evidence that, it went from Joseph of Egypt to even Joshua had it with the Canaanites, and then to Laban, who was at the beginning of the Book of Mormon. Anyways, you have to read the book. Joseph of Egypt promises, I'm going to skip that. That's pretty detailed, but if you want to learn more about the promises of Joseph of Egypt with his posterity. Okay, the last middle period is consisted of a more detailed narrative of Nephite history from Lehi down to the middle of King Benjamin's reign. Although the small plates cover the same period, they provide far less detail of its events, focusing instead on prophecy and doctrinal discourse. I said that already, but there would have been a lot more about this period and what was in this 120 years. No, how long was it? 2 centuries between Jacob and the destruction occurring in the year 320. Well, so these are some locations that would have probably been in the Lost Pages based on, it says, Mormon takes care to introduce these locations in his remaining abridgment. There are other locations that he does not bother to introduce when first mentioning them, implying that he had already introduced them in the Lost Manuscript. Okay, so in the Lost Middle Period, this blew my mind because we know about the the destruction of the Nephite nation at the end of the Book of Mormon. After the Savior comes, the Nephites were righteous for a time, but then not even 400 years had passed after Christ that they were destroyed. But there was actually an early Nephite nation that was also destroyed. And the Lost Middle Pages would have explained about this early Nephite nation, that it had 200 years of ascent and 200 years of decline. 2 centuries of rise followed by 2 centuries of fall. In this arc, the early Nephite nation paralleled the rise and fall of the later Nephite nation chronicled in Mormon's abridgment in 4th Nephi, where the Nephites' pattern of progress culminates in the 200th year after the birth of Jesus and begins to lapse in the 201st year. The early Nephite nation was destroyed 400 years after Lehi left Jerusalem. There were actually 2 Nephite nation apostasies throughout the course of Moroni's abridgment. The earlier one that we don't get to read about because it was in the Lost Pages, and then the later one. And this just strengthened my testimony that it just showed me the pattern of apostasy that the Lord works with, that people tend to go through this pride cycle of gaining knowledge and righteousness and building Zion, and then pride slips in and these nations and societies fall. And it's a good lesson for us too. I think we're kind of at the peak of a pride cycle in America right now, and we can't think we're any better than these other nations that if you like the Lord told the Nephites, keep my commandments and you shall prosper in the land. This land will be a land of promise. But if you don't, it won't be your land of promise. He'll give it to another people. So what caused this destruction? So there's some evidence, that this early Nephite nation was warned by a prophet named Aminadi. Now, I know that sounds a lot like Abinadi, but different prophet. Based on Book of Mormon precedent and principle, the people of the land of Nephi should have been warned repeatedly and then with urgent finality that in resisting the commandments, they were ripening for destruction. The pattern of God first sending prophets to warn his people, intensifying the warning as the end draw near. So who's Aminadi? I had never heard of this guy, but I guess there's a sentence in our current Book of Mormon that Amulek says. So Aminadi is one of Amulek's descendants. Amulek says, I am Amulek. I am the son of Gedana, who was the son of Ishmael, who was a descendant of Aminadi. And it was that same Aminadi who interpreted the writing which was upon the wall of the temple, which was written by the finger of God. And Aminadi was a descendant of Nephi, who was the son of Lehi, who came out of the land of Jerusalem, who was a descendant of Manasseh, who was the son of Joseph, who was sold into Egypt by the hands of his brother. But that part right there, that Aminadi interpreted the writing on the wall of the temple. So what is this story about that was in the Lost Pages? So it shows that because Amulek didn't explain too much more and emphasized his ancestor Aminadi, it shows that it was a familiar one to the people, and Aminadi was pretty famous. And okay. So yeah, I'm not going to go into all the detail, but I'll just give you a sneak peek that if you want to learn about the story of Aminadi and the temple and warning the early Nephites about not taking care of the temple and what would happen, the judgments that would come from desecrating the temple, that's a big evidence of why the early Nephite nation was destroyed. Okay, so what happened after the early Nephites were dwindled out and the Lamanites basically took them over. But there was a a small group of Nephites that were led away on another exodus by Mosiah I. And he led them to Zarahemla, where they met the Mulekites, and then this small group of righteous Nephites that had fled the city of Nephi because it was being destroyed and it was unrighteous and the Lamanites were taking over. So they fled. This small group finds these people, the Mulekites, and then Mosiah starts this reformation of the Nephites to get them ready for Jesus Christ to come. He would guide his people to a new promised land, steer them away from idolatry, and prepare them for the promised Messiah revealed to their father Lehi. Don't confuse it with Mosiah II, the central king in our extant book of Mosiah. Mosiah I would have been given a lot more detail in the early pages, lost pages. So yeah, he led an exodus of the remaining righteous in the land of Nephi to a new home in the land of Zarahemla, establishing the temple of Mosiah. There's another temple that was established. Following the corruption of the temple of Nephi, initiating a new dynasty monarchy no longer led by Nephi's patrilineal heir, founding a new nation comprised of both Lehites and Mulekites, and receiving revelation as a seer through the Jaredite stone interpreters rather than Liahona. Okay, from the record of Zeniff, we know that total destruction came to the people of the land of Nephi, as evidenced by the takeover by the Lamanites to their capital city of Nephi and to the temple of Nephi, as evidenced by Zeniff's son Noah needing to restore it. With a land void of Nephite people or religion, Zeniff's attempt to reclaim the land of our fathers' first inheritance required his own conquest, mirroring that of Joshua and Nephi ahead of him, one initiated with spies and concluded by clearing out the land's previous inhabitants. So yeah, what calamity overtook and destroyed the first Nephite nation? Jacob's prophecy offers clues. The Nephites' failure to repent allowed the Lamanites' scourging of them even unto destruction, so their land of inheritance would be possessed by the Lamanites. Mosiah I led his people away from false worship in a defiled temple in the land of Nephi and taught the Mulekites the worship of their forgotten God. Okay, yeah, more and more about that. Okay, the lost pages would have given more about the history of the Mulekites, or people of Zarahemla, and Don Bradley goes into the craziest story of the origin of the Mulekites, going back to a royal people of 4 male royals and 4 female royals that were raised up to the lineage of King David. And anyways, the story's crazy about how the Mulekites were part of King David's kingdom. Then they were royal descendants of David. They came out of Jerusalem at the time of Zedekiah, and the story behind it is all in this book. Anyways. Okay, and then we would have had more about how Mosiah I and the Mulekites met up, and why Mosiah I was chosen as their leader. If the Mulekites were this royal people of King David, why would Mosiah I be designated their king? Why would they have that humility? Well, 3 likely factors are Mosiah I's lineage, his supernatural power, which means like him using the Jaredite using the Jaredite interpreters. There's evidence Mosiah I used the Jaredite interpreters. And the Nephites' maintenance of their language and scripture, because the Mulekites, it says that they didn't have a written record. So a people without a written record aren't going to be able to do the Lord's will. They needed to be reminded of who they were. Okay. All right, I'm going to finish up. The last part that would have been in the lost pages is more about King Benjamin. clues in the published Book of Mormon indicate that our Book of Mosiah is missing its original first 2 chapters that likely contained early narratives of Benjamin's reign. The clue to the existence of these missing chapters is located where Mormon's abridgment resumes, right after the lost pages end, in the opening verse of the Book of Mosiah. This chapter begins with Benjamin's reign already in progress, thus catching the narrative in midstream. So the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mosiah lacks a chapter 1 and 2. Instead, it oddly begins with chapter 3. So there's a lot of evidence that the lost pages were indeed lost because of these errors in the printer's manuscript, or they tried to make do with what they had. Okay, so what could have been in those chapters? The 2 conflicts are likely the subject of the first 2 chapters: Benjamin's military conflict with the invading Lamanites, internal contention and spiritual conflict of false Christs, false prophets, and false preachers and teachers. Okay, last part that I think needs emphasized is a lot of times growing up in the church, you think that it's 116 pages. That's what you've always been told. But Don Bradley is able to show that it was much more likely way more than 116 pages. More like 300 pages. Now, if you really think about that, that's pretty tragic that we lost all of that when Martin Harris lost these pages. And I think it's a test of our faith even more. But what we have of the Book of Mormon suffices. It is enough. But I love this book because it just awakened me, opened my eyes to the wholeness of the Book of Mormon. If we had all of Mormon's abridgment, just how complete of a book it would be with these Old Testament connections into the, more of the New Testament prophecies and church. So it just makes me realize, like, even though I'm so grateful for the Book of Mormon we have now, that I just wish I could have read those lost pages. But in a way, I have been able to read those lost pages because of all of Don Bradley's work. He is truly a saint. And I should say Don Bradley was inactive in the church, or he left the church for 10 years. And in the course of him being a historian, working in one of the church history departments, he was just really interested in church history. Even though he wasn't he left the church, he was still interested in it, and he is a researcher and historian. So he kept looking at all these papers and stuff of the early restoration and did an internship and all that. And he, after all of this research about the lost pages and other things, he turned a new leaf and realized, like, he knew the gospel was true again and the restoration was true. So that's a really cool other story of the author. Okay, I'm just going on lots of tangents, but there's, like I said, this book review was a long time coming because I just had to think about everything and really put it in like a presentation to really explain all that I was thinking and all these connections about the Book of Mormon. So yeah, it was probably way more than 116 pages, and he's able to show evidence that it was. The various lines of evidence we have explored have all produced similar outcomes. When we consider the amount of time covered by the lost manuscript, we find that Mormon's abridgment for that period should have totaled 282 to 390 pages. When we consider the time spent translating the lost manuscript, we find that Joseph's translation output should have totaled well over 300 pages. When we consider insider reports, which have Martin alone scribing for near 200 pages, after, this is key, and I didn't know this, there were already 4 other scribes before Martin Harris. We arrive at a manuscript that could readily total over 300 pages. Okay, we're going to end this. All right, so I'll end with my favorite things about this book. Along with what I've already shared, those were some favorite things. But my favorite thing was Don Bradley gave one of the best descriptions of the translation of the Book of Mormon that I've ever heard about spiritual light on the seer stones. I'll just read this. Several of Joseph Smith's early revelations, which were also given through the spiritual light shining in darkness from the seer stone, evoke and develop the symbolism inherent in their mode of delivery. One such revelation was to his brother Hiram that said, D&C, in the power of Jesus Christ, or in my power which speaketh unto thee, for behold, it is I that speaketh. Behold, I am the light which shineth in darkness, and by my power I give these words unto thee. Thus, the medium through which this revelation was received, words of light appearing on the stone amid darkness, is invoked in the revelation itself to authenticate the revelation's message and identify its divine author. The luminous words seen by Joseph in the seer stone were given by the power of him who is the light which shineth in darkness, the power of Jesus Christ. And I like how he made parallels with Joseph Smith with Moses and getting the law on the Mount Sinai, the Lord touching the writing, and then the story of the brother of Jared, who also saw the Lord's finger touch the stones and give light. And Joseph Smith was another prophet that the Lord revealed himself to and gave him light while he was translating. So I like the parallel. And I also liked how the Book of Mormon had seals on it. Did you know that? And it fulfilled the biblical prophecy in Isaiah about a unlearned man. Read this, I pray thee, and he saith, I am not learned. Isaiah 29:11, it fulfilled that because the Book of Mormon had seals on it, and Joseph Smith Martin Harris took it to a scholar of the day, Charles Anthon, to figure it out, and he couldn't, even though he was the scholar of the day, so that fulfills Isaiah's prophecy. Anyways, I also liked how Don Bradley explained what probably happened to the Book of Mormon after Joseph translated it, that it was sealed up, and what sealed up means. I really, really loved all the patterns and themes and parallels with the Old Testament, and it just proves to me that Lehi and Nephi were Israelites. They were fleeing Jerusalem, and they had all these traditions and influences in helping them make a new Israel in America, in Jerusalem, a new Jerusalem. So Lehi's parallels to Moses, Nephi's parallels to David and Joshua, how the Lamanites were to the Nephites, what the Canaanites were to the Israelites. Just so many connections that I had never made about that. Anyways, I have so much I could say about this book, but I'm just gonna leave it at that. And please, if you want to learn more about this book, besides watching my book review here, I've also posted about this book on my Instagram page, Spiritual Thoughts with Shelbs. And I have some really cool posts that I share from this book. So thank you for listening, and buy this book.